Since the war in Ukraine began, there have been a number of fairly serious policy debates in the West regarding the provision of military aid and financial support for Ukraine. But there's been an evolving consensus that supports either current or increased support. But recently, in January, the RAND Corporation published a report that basically promotes a position that was previously only argued by fringe elements of the left and the right. And Henry Kissinger at the beginning of the war, but he changed his mind. So I'd like to take a critical look at this report and demonstrate why it's wrong on a whole series of levels. So the report itself is called Avoiding the Long War, U.S. Policy and the Trajectory of the Russia-Ukraine Conflict. And it starts out, this war is the most significant interstate conflict in decades, and its evolution will have major consequences for the United States. It is appropriate to assess how this conflict may evolve, what alternative trajectories might mean for U.S. interests, and what Washington can do to promote a trajectory that best serves U.S. interests. Now that's fairly reasonable. U.S. policy should reflect the best interests of the United States. Hard to argue with that. And I've provided the full a link to the report. It's online and it's free, so if you want to look at it, feel free to do so. So I've really struggled with trying to present the structure of present this report on the basis of the structure that it uses. For the most part, that simply reflects how muddled the presentation is. But I'm going to try to make use of it. They begin by defining what they call key dimensions to alternative war trajectories. Now, I think both dimensions and trajectories in this context can really muddle or confuse people more than enlighten. But in any case, the dimensions they provide are the possible Russian use of nuclear weapons, possible escalation to a Russia-NATO conflict, territorial control, duration, form of war termination. So there's 5 dimensions. And almost immediately, the authors point out that, to quote, Russian use of nuclear weapons and a Russia-NATO conflict are the main aspects, the main dimensions to avoid. So that's the priority. And nobody really disagrees with that at the moment. There are very few people who argue in favor of Russia using nuclear weapons, and there are very few people who argue in favor of NATO troops fighting in Ukraine. So what's the problem? Well, to begin with, they suggest that the third priority out of 5 dimensions, remember we're now into the middle dimension, they suggest that the analysis shows that the duration of the war, so how long it'll last, is the most important of the remaining dimensions for the United States. And that's couched in, well, the longer the war goes on, the more probability there is of nuclear war. And in a sense, that's fair enough. As is that, the war might escalate to a Russia-NATO conflict. Because there is a non-zero probability of either of those events happening. But you have to ask, if you're thinking about these things, you have to ask, well, how high a probability? Is it the probability of an asteroid hitting the Earth and wiping out all life on the planet, probability-wise? Or is it the probability of a car accident happening today? Because both are probabilities, but they're very different in terms of the year-on-year probability. And I think the authors want to emphasize that it's relatively likely, if the war goes on, that escalation will happen. I don't actually agree with that. I think that the odds of a nuclear war or NATO direct military fighting with Russia is a very, very small probability at this stage. And there's just no basis for what these authors are suggesting justifies arguing that the duration of the war is a serious threat to U.S. interests. As a matter of fact, given how this war is currently playing out, the odds of Ukraine winning this war are increasing over time. And that's because of the massive material aid and financial support that they're receiving, while the Russians are on their own. It skews the ultimate outcome in favor of Ukraine. And that's a good thing, in my opinion. I don't think Russia is prepared to use nuclear weapons because the consequences would be potentially catastrophic, and there's no gain. And I don't think NATO countries are prepared to directly intervene, no matter how poorly the Ukrainians ultimately perform at this point in time. And I think we can only work with what's currently happening. So the territorial control question is also addressed, obviously. And in this dimension, the authors argue that too much emphasis is made of further territorial gains by Ukraine by current U.S. policy. They're more or less arguing that, well, Russia is currently holding controls about 20% of Ukrainian territory, and that's not expected to change anytime soon. And even if Ukraine managed to push the Russians back to the pre-February 2022 lines, they'd still end up controlling Ukrainian territory. And so from an international law perspective, they're in violation of agreements regardless. And I think it's a I don't know. Well, you have to have a pretty postmodern mindset to believe that the fact that the United States won't recognize Russian territorial control is somehow or other adequate, which is what the authors actually argue. That's just not true. For any observers, in other words, states that are not involved, Russia holding any of that territory will basically suggest that in the world as it is today, military force can be used for state objectives internationally. You can change borders by going to war and winning. I don't think anyone would think Russia is the loser if it continues to hold Ukrainian territory at the end of this war. And that's really important. And the authors of this report seem utterly oblivious to it. I really don't know why. And so now we come to the form of war termination that the authors discuss. Yeah, wow. Essentially, the author's position is well, they actually sort of stated directly, but their position is that Ukraine simply can't win this war. And so therefore, negotiations are inevitable and desirable. And consequently, the United States should put conditions on future military aid that require Ukrainian commitment to negotiations. That is a thoroughly wrong-headed position, and it's simply not true that Ukraine can't win. But let's first look at I don't want to get into a theoretical argument here about what is the chances of the Ukraine winning this war or the Russians winning this war. I want to look at how these authors end up holding that position, and they do it basically by defining winning as to quote, this comes from a book by Dan Reiter. What's his name? Dan Reiter. The book's called How to End Wars. I've included a link to it. Unfortunately, there's only samplings available as far as I know. It was published in 2009. But anyway, they use his they quote him as with the following: absolute victory, as Dan Reiter notes, can be accomplished through the victor installing a new leadership in the defeated state, occupying or annexing the adversary's territory, or at worst annihilating the adversary's entire population. Well, on that basis, Ukraine is not likely to win. But that's a ridiculous position to hold. I don't think anyone believes the Ukrainians are planning to drive on Moscow and replace the Russian government. They have no intention of occupying or annexing Russian territory beyond the territories that are internationally recognized as Ukrainian territory. And they're not planning to wipe out the population of Russia. It's a ridiculous position to hold. But they use that definition because it serves their argument. But it creates a remarkable false dichotomy, because the choices are absolute victory, or there'll have to be negotiations that will lead to an armistice or a peace treaty, preferably a peace treaty. It's just ridiculous. I mean, I shouldn't use harsh language for this sort of thing, but it's really an untenable position, in my opinion. Most wars end with, well, someone wins on the battlefield and negotiations reflect the facts on the ground. That's how most wars end. This idea that they're promoting is that it's either absolute victory or negotiations, is wrong. But it is what justifies the pressure for negotiations. So I don't know. I don't know what you think. I think this is deeply flawed as a position to hold, and it's actually contrary to U.S. interests, because I don't see allowing Russia to have any Ukrainian territory or forcing Ukraine into a peace as benefiting the United States or the West in general. Anyway, that's my thoughts on it. Have a look at the report if you want, and feel free to leave comments. I'd appreciate it. Let me know what you think. So that's about all I have for today. Thank you.